Well, first of all, it created a lot of scaremongering, lots of which we can still kind of see the effects of to this day. I mean, it's not specifically related to time and place. We've seen this stuff happen in the USA. We saw it happen after the Columbine shootings with the demonization of people like Marilyn Manson, with the video game Doom. People looking for easy targets to blame for terrible things happening. But nonetheless, there remains a sense in which horror movies in particular are wrapped up in this kind of being blamed for sadistic acts or social evils. However, one of the main repercussions of the Video Nasties scare was actually an increased popularity in horror movies, because what happens if you're a 13, 14-year-old kid and you're told that there are all these horrible movies that are full of violence and terrible things and that you're not allowed to see them? Well, of course, you get a cult fan base immediately. It had a kind of a double effect with different segments of society, I think. The interesting thing about the list is that you see kind of specific genres, specific movements that aren't necessarily so popular anymore. One that was particularly controversial was the so-called rape revenge genre film, which included I Spit on Your Grave.
Take off your clothes.
I don't like women giving me orders.
I Spit on Your Grave.
And Last House on the Left, which involves a young woman being attacked and then either taking revenge herself or, in the case of Last House on the Left, her parents. And of course what you get with that is the evil deeds of the villains are sufficiently nasty to warrant their own horrifically gory killing. So it kind of is encouraging an attitude of glee in seeing people killed. To an extent, this has probably influenced things like the so-called torture porn films. There are lots of interesting zombie movies, Italian zombie movies, which were interesting. They were giving the public something that hadn't been really seen before in this country. Should they have been censored? Not necessarily.
The term video nasty, as I keep mentioning, is quite vague, it's undefined. It isn't something that's rooted in time and place. You know, and even though we kind of associate video nasty with the 1980s, the beginnings of the 1980s, particularly throughout the decade and even into the early 90s, if a violent film or a violent television show, particular violent films, are produced and kind of move into the almost the mainstream, so like you said, like Saw or the Hostel franchises, they kind of move into the mainstream, then that term seems to be reapplied, and as soon as it brings in all that kind of ideological baggage. So, for example, Saw, when Saw came out, it was rejected by the establishment. Critics were horrified that this film came out and saw it as entertainment for that kind of prurient, almost kind of masochistic spectator. But the films did incredibly well. All of them grossed over 100 million on very small budgets, so public were actually identifying with it. And again, it might be connected to that association people have with the video nasty. So in one way, the video nasty can elicit that kind of outrage, but at the same time, for fans, it's like, great, this film is something I want to watch. And it might drive them more toward the film than had it hadn't been applied. So we do see that happening. But at the same time, the BBFC, so in the UK, I think has much more of a central role with regards to the classification of film. And it's able to do its job more than it was in the 1980s, when it was quite marginalised and the Department of Public Prosecutions were basically making the decisions and sending their guidelines to the BBFC. So if we do have a problematic film, like a Serbian film, the BBFC can treat that and kind of almost make it palatable, and make it safe by taking those problematic scenes out. And in doing so, saying, look, we are effective. We can almost sanitize these films and make them safe for public consumption. And even if they can't do that, they can reject them. I don't think we necessarily had that in place in the 1980s, because films were censored. They weren't. They were just withdrawn. I mean, they did issue cuts, but when the Video Recordings Act came in and all these films were taken away, it doesn't happen now. So there is that change, which is significant, even though we might be using that terminology of video nasty and using it in similar ways with the internet and with the fact now we can buy films from all over the world, even if they're not available in the UK. So I guess we've moved towards the internet, and we saw with Cameron trying to put those kind of anti-porn things onto people's computers, and they could opt in or opt out. It doesn't work because there's ways around that, of course. I mean, any new technology that comes around, there's always a kind of moral panic over it. It becomes a kind of folk devil. Television and cinema, and then we have video, and then of course we've got the internet, and the internet's this kind of medium now that cannot be controlled, as much as people are trying to do that, governments or agencies are trying to do that. And when Cameron was Prime Minister, he went out on that kind of crusade to try and limit or even stop people watching pornography online. And again, everybody kind of laughed at that and thought, well, yeah, you could put these measures in place, but we're too media savvy now. We're kind of like media natives. We can just bypass that. And he was rightly kind of ridiculed for that. And this is a similar thing that was going on in the 80s with videos, but of course it was much more successful because of that lack of accessibility to the medium, but also to other opportunities of getting the content. With the internet, it's very difficult now to limit or put a stop on things.
We see very few scares about video games happening in the 80s, largely due to the fact that 2D pixelated characters aren't generally that shockingly graphic. But that really hits home in the 90s with games like Mortal Kombat being censored and great kind of debates over it might be all right to have one character punching another, but if there's blood coming out, then that's completely taboo. And then later on in the 2000s, of course, Grand Theft Auto is kind of being portrayed by the Daily Mail as a prostitute killing simulation. It's almost, the thing I find really fascinating about the kind of narrative around Video Nasties is that it is itself a kind of gothic narrative. It almost implies a kind of a possession, that there's some kind of evil within these films which comes into the home and then will take over the child usually, or someone who's not judged to be as mentally capable as the rest of us. And there's certain kind of snobbery around that. We might compare it to the Lady Chatterley's Lover trial, where of course the prosecution asked, is this a book you would wish your wife or servants to read? And there's a sense in which the BBFC were setting themselves up as this board of kind of very sage and knowledgeable censors, but this material shouldn't be seen by the general public because it has the capacity to harm the kind of the young or the feeble-minded. Think about some personal memories here. I was quite young when all of this was happening, and of course we'd already seen a bit of a boom in slasher movies in the late 70s, but it had a knock-on effect of the popularity of horror movies and the kind of nastiness of them, at least as far as I can recall. When I was at primary school, all the talk was about the Nightmare on Elm Street films and all of the gory things that happened in them, like in one of the sequels where Freddy pulls the veins from children and makes them dance like puppets. And all of this leads to a certain culture kind of that goes hand in hand with the technology of videotapes, of passing around, of copying, of piracy, actually, as well. And yeah, I think this continues to the 90s with video games and things. I'm not sure how much of this is new. If you look at the late 1700s, you had Gothic novels being passed about by young women in particular, and people were wringing their hands about these young women reading these stories about bandits and werewolves and dark forests and all of that kind of thing. But people were reading them exactly for the reason that they were horrid and shocking, and the more horrid and shocking, the better. I think some of the focus has shifted. I think there's an element of this becoming a bit outdated. When some of this is revisited around 2000, it was evident that horror movies that have been released since then were more extreme than the original Video Nasties, so it seemed a bit silly. But it was interesting, it wasn't until the early 2000s until you saw, for example, The Exorcist released on home video or DVD. It was considered suitable to be viewed in the cinema. But the idea that you could take it home and watch it over and over again, and of course that the child might get their hands on it, was still considered to be sort of beyond the pale at the time. But really the kind of increasing level of violence and gore in films has made some of these early films look a bit silly, really, with the kind of tomato ketchup looking spurts of blood, and all of this, almost kind of comical. And lots of them had this humour in them to begin with, and the way in which the audience didn't take these seriously. They weren't a manifesto for killing and cannibalism.
By the time they believe in him, it'll be too late.
In the 1980s, it really did get a sense that you were very much kind of abnormal for liking these films, or for liking horror films. And I don't think that's necessarily the case now, although recently when we've seen films like It, Stephen King's It, or Jordan Peele's Get Out, doing very, very well at the box office, there's been this kind of push to try to reclassify these films as not horror. So we've seen, where we go back to something like Silence of the Lambs as calling a psychological thriller rather than a horror movie, and we come out and have a look at these films. They may be thrillers, or they may be kind of political dramas, or they one of the terms that was used in The Guardian, of course, which was again picked up in social media, was this idea of post-horror. That these weren't typical horror films. They were better than that because they had these kind of quality elements to them, or they were well acted, or they were well directed. And it kind of forgets the entire history of horror, right back from the early days of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, how well directed and acted and structured and put together all these films tended to be, and how they've emerged as classics, not only of the genre, but of cinema in general. So we definitely have that kind of disconnect that, you can't like horror. And if you do find yourself liking a horror film, then you have to kind of dress it up as something that isn't horror. So you did feel as if you were abnormal, or you were unreasonable. The Daily Mail would read these incredibly incendiary kind of headlines about how these films rape the minds of children, and you thought, my God, I like these films, I watch these films, what does that say about me? But it did strengthen that kind of resolve and that identity, and that continued through the 1980s. And you notice that a lot of people that watched or kind of experienced those video nasty period of the 1980s have moved out into either setting up their own conferences, Fright Fest, for example, or their own fanzines in the 1990s, or have even moved into making and producing horror films. So, it really strengthened that kind of identity and love of horror, which is a good thing.
Hey guys, thank you for watching this Video Nasties overview documentary. It was a lot of fun to make, and I just really wanted to thank the people involved, and if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Keep up to date with all our videos that we release weekly. Thank you very much.